Okay, so I think we have this all set. My dragon is here to watch. My books are up and back. And we have Moonrise's Call. It's actually a small book. It's pretty quick. We should be able to go through this pretty quick. Yeah, January 31st, Song of the Rising Deep, Book 2 of Oss Story releases. You can pre-order it now. If you check my page, you can find the links. Yeah. So I'm going to scroll up so I can see. Guardian of the Tide. So. Okay. So, we are going to begin. Moonrise's Call by Guardians of the Tide, Book 1, of course, by Brand J. Alexander. Moi. If you actually go on my website, you can find a longer story of how I came up with this book. I was actually writing my initial novels, Rise of Tears and Fall of Tears. They were written as a single story kind of in the beginning, then split up into 2 books. But in between, when I had to take a break from writing, I would go to the local pool and swim laps, and the people I interacted with, the stories I heard, the kind of personalities that I was introduced to, the friends that I made, they inspired Moonrise's Call. And yeah, I went home and started writing it, and then the story expanded greatly from there, so let's dive in to the world of water. Okay. Chapter 1. The song of the sea was always a calming force for Oss, capable of soothing the greatest stirrings in his heart. But not tonight. Tonight there was a strangeness to its resounding crystal cadence, a peculiar note intruding upon the harmony of waves and water all around him. The heightened senses of Oss' ears, like those of all his people, were immune to the muffling effects of being under water as he was now. He could identify the distinct aqueous stirrings and eddies and currents from every direction by the particular melody among the blaring symphony of the sea. But the rhythm this evening was different in ways he'd never experienced. A mysterious disturbance overlaid Oss' awareness, distorting the familiar song with a thrumming pulse that refused to relent. It was more than just an oddity with his natural perception, however. The nagging force was beginning to influence him physically as well. Something pulled at Oss, drawing him from his slumber with a persistence that continued into wakefulness. It tugged tenaciously at his floating body, yearning to lead him from the sea and up into the star-filled heavens. Nothing seemed to lessen the growing summons of its call, and it was that touch that finally gave its identity away. A moontide was coming. Oss had never felt similar urges, but never quite... Oss had felt similar urges, but never quite this powerful, never with such a growing sense of urgency. It would be closer than one had ever come to the barges before in his 17 years of life. That closeness and added strength affected him differently this time, stirring a host of new sensations of life within him. There was no alert, no tide callers riding in to tell the small floating town to anchor or quickly push off into the currents to avoid the coming moontide. Somehow, Oss didn't need those warnings this time. He knew Moonrise was coming with a stunning certainty, whether the legendary Guardians of the Tide arrived to warn the populace or not. Oss had no way to know if the inevitable panic of a moontide had reached the people of the town yet. He never stayed the night on the floating island of lashed-together flotsam and corkwood like the rest of the barge's population, so he wasn't close enough to witness any excitement among the rickety rafts and piers in those quiet hours before dawn. Hi, Alexa. Oss knew, however, whether the chaos had begun yet or not, that it would start eventually. It always did. The people of the barges were excitable and tended to fuss over the slightest offenses. Something of this magnitude was bound to stir them up. It was apparent the barges hadn't pulled anchor and set adrift from the Sagrasa currents to escape the current coming moontide yet. The tie rope Oss wore around his ankle while he slept in the embrace of the waves still tugged in the familiar direction of the bobbing platform village. It chafed a little, but it prevented him from drifting away in the night. Not having to swim over an hour to get home every morning was worth a bit of raw skin, he reasoned. For a moment, Oss attempted to relax and enjoy the caress of the currents, despite the impending moonrise. His shoulder-length hair danced fluidly in the waves in mimicry of the Sagrasa seagrasses that flourished along the shallow path of the current with the same name. The coppery bronze curls swayed around his face and neck with tickling flutter, soothing him with 1,000 wet, feathery touches. The peaceful moment was short-lived, however. Splash! Oss coughed as a lapping wave broke across his face, filling his mouth and nose. He hadn't expected it, and that was just one more oddity. As a creature of the sea, he knew its moods and stirrings. His body, instinctually, understood how to align itself with the flows, so such an occurrence would never happen. The sea was erratic, though, even now when the current should still be sluggish before the approaching moonrise. They twisted oddly, and no matter how hard he tried to realign with them, Ost couldn't seem to get it right. The constant tugging from the skies certainly didn't help. All of these seemingly minor and unremarkable oddities added up for Ost, who was very much a creature of his environment. He needed that connection to feel in control, and yet, since late last night, the foundation of his confidence was slowly slipping away like a sagrasa blossom, lost upon the currents. As much as he tried to focus on the waters and feel his natural oneness, Ost was unable to drown out the call of the coming moontide, which overwhelmed everything. The conflict wore on his nerves, making him extra irritable. He never liked mornings, and he hadn't slept well through the night. It was a confluence of discomfort that left him craving nothing but relief. Ost turned upright in the water during his recent coughing fit, his head sticking out of the surface as he bobbed vertically in the waves. The tug of the tie rope pulled a bit harder in his position, and a second constricting pressure began to tighten around his opposite leg. It wasn't chafing or tugging like the rope. It was clinging and sucking like a tentacle or some deep horror sliming its way up his thigh. Ost barely cringed as he reached down to clutch the offending creature around a long, slithering body that was the consistency of a sopping wet biscuit. "Do you mind not doing that, Funk?" Ost called down through the water surface. "I don't mind if you curl around my ankle when we sleep, but please don't slither up me like that. It leaves a slime trail." Ost drew the aptly named dredgeel above the surface, gripped by its dopey, grinning black head. The foul, splotchy creature gave a snorting, gurgling sort of laugh, through its spout-shaped nose, as it met Ost's eyes. The smell which followed could quite literally be called a funk. Ost dropped the semi-gelatinous creature back into the water with a wet, splattering plop. The consistency of dredgeels never seemed to emit anything audible that wasn't somehow unsettling. From slurching to splatting, they were a chorus to turn the stomach. Thankfully, he was used to this vile little stink demon. Ost raised Funk from a tiny fingerling baby after finding him lost following a storm. He had a bad habit of taking on orphans like that, even foul ones nobody would dare consider touching, let alone raising. Funk was a friend, of course, and a pet, but the line between those two distinctions was blurred beyond recognition. As was apparent in the way they slept, the two were rarely apart, and if they weren't different species, one could almost think they were siblings. Funk took great pleasure in his vileness and sharing it with others, especially his adoptive humanoid brother. It was merely the spirit of dredgeels to be repugnant. If Ost were ever to make up a story of their creation, he felt confident the foul accident of dredgeels would begin with a cast-off glob from a divine sneeze, or the oozing of some horrific plague that even gods could catch. For surely these creatures were not created with intent, but as an accident of divine excretion. Hello, yeah, Funk seems to be a common, frequent favorite. If you knew what if you've read the blog, you know where he was thought up, or what his inspiration was. The living snot trail had a heart somewhere in all that glop, though, and he loved Ost unconditionally. Of course, that was only on the condition Ost continued to provide the staple snacks Funk loved so much. But beyond that, his slimy little slug heart was his. Ost wiped as much of the slime trail off his leg as he could, though the sludge clung to him persistently even in the churning currents. When he finally gave up on it, he untied the rope from his leg and set off gliding through the dark waters. Those who dictated the rules for life on the barges insisted all children should learn to navigate by the stars in case they ever got lost. Ost was unfortunately not free from the boredom of those early childhood teachings growing up. Although he never needed it, Ost knew the sea and its currents. He could lower his head beneath the surface and follow the trill of the waves lapping against the corkwood planks of the barges all the way home with his eyes closed if need be. So he didn't need the stars now as he set his course among the stirring ripples of the surrounding seagrass beds and coral troughs. Ost knew what he was after and exactly where to find it, so he proceeded determinedly, barely stirring awake as he passed. Funk followed along behind him, bubbling and snorting with his little spouted nostrils as the waves washed over his snake-like head. The destination had become a morning routine for Ost as much as he tried to resist it. The craving, which drove him, built until he could almost taste the reward at the end of his journey, mixed with the sharp mineral tang of the sea. He'd managed to resist for a few days out of a sense of restraint, but his current mood called for a relaxing of the prohibition. Although he always found a reason to come back, it always won him in the end. Just a second. Discord communication. A few prudes from the barges discovered Ost's bad habit several cycles back and confiscated his last stash of spine corals to use for bait drugging. He knew where another colony of precious little growths lived, however. Ost transplanted there several summers ago for just such an occasion. Today he was thankful he had. The incessant draw of the coming moontide prickled his skin with an uncomfortably nagging tingle, and he needed something to drown out the sensation before he went mad. His hiding spot was a point on the very edge of the Sagrasa Summer Isle, and conveniently the deepest part of the entire shallow landmass. Anywhere else on the isle, the Sagrasa grass would overgrow the corals and smother them, but at these slightly greater depths, a colony of spine corals had a chance. Oss filled his large barrel-like chest with air and adjusted his buoyancy with barely a thought to sink below the waters, well before he reached the destination. It was unlikely anyone could see him out here, swimming so low across the sea surface. But he wasn't taking any chances. This colony was his last stash on the island. It would be several more cycles or more yet before the barges migrated down the Sagrasa Beltway, to where he could find a replacement colony. The wispy blades of Sagrasa grass tugged and fluttered across his skin as he descended into the forest of swaying reddish-brown stalks. The sun hadn't yet peaked above the horizon, so everything was still just different depths of shadow. But Oss' ears told him what he needed to know. He could detect the resonance of the sea song echoing off the old ruins ahead. There were ruins everywhere in the world of Nyx. The fallen might of a long-forgotten empire was the bedrock upon which Oss' world was constructed, or at least upon which it existed. Nothing built lasted long upon Nyx anymore, nothing more than lashed rafts and corkwood huts at least. Only the ancient rubble held firm among the many ruins. Oss had marked the song of this spot. An instinctual part of his brain effortlessly followed that harmony to its source. It was coralite, like so much of what the fallen civilizations of Nyx created. It was grown or constructed of a similar substance secreted by the polyps and shell puckins, who tended and formed the reefs. Flecks of metal and other elements infused it, making it shimmer with an opalescence even in complete darkness. Yeah, sorry, I am getting over sick, but I've got a sudden tickle in my throat today, so, of course, right before reading. Oss could almost feel the glimmer of the stone in its song, for that was one more remarkable facet of its construction. Ruins of the old world sang with a harmony unlike anything else in the seas of Nyx, and that song was growing with a deep throbbing pulse in response to the skyward draw of the nearing moontide. But it was not the singing stone Oss was here to find. Nestled in among the shimmering old world ruins was a line of thorny shells, their needle-like structures bristling along the fallen column threateningly. The current of a passing fish was their trigger, and the spine corals would send a venomous dart with deadly accuracy to pierce and paralyze its meal before dragging it back to be devoured. It was those darts Oss was after. For a little bug thing inside of a rock, spine corals were actually quite clever. They could detect the differences in the currents around them and tell if the movement before them was something they could eat. There was no sense in paralyzing and killing a sea grabber if its body would only smother the colony and kill everyone involved. Unfortunately, for Oss, this meant obtaining his prize wasn't as simple as waving his hand in front of them to get them to spit. But he was resourceful, and he had funk. Most coral darters broke the polyp stalks off and injected themselves that way, but then you killed the polyp too. Every dose diminished the colony, and depending on the season, it could take a while for spine corals to regrow. That didn't happen the way Oss harvested them. It meant the stalk he used today would regrow and be reharvested in less than a cycle. Oss nodded to Funk to initiate the off-practice maneuver. This feat, among many others, was just one of the reasons it paid to put up with a creature as vile as a dredgeal. The nasty little snot trail's consistency made him the perfect receptacle to receive the spine coral's dart without triggering the release of the precious venom it contained on contact. Funk slithered through the water, intently. Even his wake appeared to slide just short of touching his rank, coily little body, thanks to his continually replenishing slime coat. He wiggled his tail up until it stood almost in front of the bristling shell, then he gave a contemptuous flip of the tip directly in the opening as he grinned crookedly back at Oss. He was excited for the chance to repay his friend for something, or perhaps to apologize for the earlier sliming. Like a fluted pipe set to lips, a small yellowish dart shot from the tip of the spine coral like with a flicker. A dredgeal, however, has a body unlike almost anything in the world of Nyx. Some naturalists even question whether they have an actual body at all, or whether they're just an inconstant gloppy state of ick with no true indefinable form. Most scholars who have gotten bids of dredgeal, stuck to their feet once or twice, usually side with this conclusion wholeheartedly without any need for further investigation or discussion. And they were all quite right with this assessment, for when the dart struck Funk, it was as if it had collided with a bowl of thick pudding. There was no substantial impact as the pointed tip impaled the little dredgeal's tail. There was nothing firm enough in Funk's body for an actual collision to occur. Instead, the coral dart just sank into the black and brown mottled sludge of the eel's body and quickly slowed to a halt, never triggered to release its venom. Funk sneered triumphantly and gave a slow, bubbling chortle, little drips of dredge escaping from his mouth and swirling in clouded torrents towards the surface. He flipped his tail around with a dramatic flare until it was right in front of Oss' face. Then somehow the gooey thief withdrew the viscous tissue from around the dart, leaving it floating in the waters of the sea, only partially slimed from its recent up-close encounter with the insides of a dredgeal. Not as bad as usual, Oz thought, as he took the finger-sized barb and attempted to clean it off. None of the funk would taint the precious venom, but the thought of injecting himself with anything covered in funk's insides was almost too wrong to contemplate, no matter how much he needed the creature to get his fix. So he wiped off what he could, then resigned himself to ignoring the rest. He needed it too badly to wait any longer. Some coral daughters shot up in the thigh, some under the arm. They all had their method of hiding the reddened punctures the habit created. For Ost, the hiding part was simple, but the choice of location made the administering as deadly as the chilling depths of the nether sea. Ost had a tattoo of the 3 moons of Nyx across his chest, Tethys, Erithus, and Mathis, each colored in brilliant detail among the arrangement. It was there for as long as he could remember, and every one he asked said it was there when his parents left him at the barges many years ago. He didn't know what it meant, but the colored skin was a convenient place to hide the injection sites. There was one major drawback to using his chest, however. He was inevitably shooting the spine coral venom almost directly into his heart. It could kill him, true, but that surge, that feeling, there was nothing else like it. And in high-stress moments like now, there was nothing better to soothe the raging storms and waves growing within Ost's tempestuous soul. It burned like the hot, fiery rash of a flame coral as it entered the tattooed skin of his chest. The initial jab was always the worst. The force of puncturing flesh triggered a spasm in the dart which ejected the searing venom from within. The deeper the needle went, the harder the rush of burning ichor was unleashed into his bloodstream. The barges were local reef-wiser claimed the venom was extremely thin and thus could easily permeate tissue and be carried throughout the rest of the body rapidly through the bloodstream. And whether the old coot's reasoning was sound, the conclusion was always convincing. Spine coral venom moved through Ost like a raging noontide. As the coral dart bit into his flesh, Ost felt his heart stop entirely for a fleeting moment, like a gasping moment of shock at a sudden fright. And when the organ beat once more, it was as if its lengthy pause had been an expansive draw upon the venom, for its next contraction sent a surge of the searing ichor through every vein and every vessel in his body. His lips opened wide in a moment of lost control, and a great gaping rush of air exploded from his mouth to froth and twist in a billowing cloud climbed to surface. Thankfully, Ost's lungs formed an especially deep air cavity, a trait common among many Nyxians. He wasn't going to miss the lost air anytime soon. That was fortunate, since at the moment the semi-paralyzing effect of the spine coral was taking hold. He couldn't have swum to the surface for air if he wanted to, but then he had coral venom coursing through his veins. He wouldn't have cared all that much either way. Ost decreased his buoyancy and sank to the metal-flecked sand at the bottom of the sea. He settled into the gritty bed limply, and once down didn't move. Funk circled protectively around the small opening in the sagrasa grasses, making sure nothing was able to slip up on his drug-hazed friend. He burbled and chortled along the route, emitting a sickening stream of filth that eventually formed a clouded wall around Ost's vulnerable form. There's very little alive in the Nyxian seas that will willingly pass through a Dregiel's funk cloud. While Funk worked his magic with the barrier, Ost remained almost unconscious on the ocean floor. He wasn't, of course. His mind was more expanded than ever, but in such a way that left his body devoid of conscious control. The venom, which was a paralytic for fish, was something altogether different in the blood of people of his world. Though Ost lay unmoving, he was fully capable of the feat. The venom didn't render him immobile in that way. It was just that under the initial effects, his sense of movement was taking place in a different state. At that moment, every action Ost made was through his mind in response to a flood of new sensations. They coursed through his body, overwhelming his sensory system until his entire substance felt reduced to a single vast, branching network of sparking nerve fibers. Only the venom didn't enhance sensations such as pain or cold, as he would experience in his humanoid form. Instead, it opened him to the environment around him as the extension of his body, drowning out anything else he may be feeling. It never lasted long, but for a few brief, borderline orgasmic moments, Ost felt the entirety of the world around him through his mind, from the water and the sand to the flickering sparks of life at the core of all the creatures in the nearby vicinity. It was a sense of his surroundings, similar to the song of the sea. Only instead of hearing the resonance of the world, Ost felt his understanding of the world through a pattern of electrical currents pulsing through him. He relished it, craved it, and sought at this stage to free him from the oppressive draw of the coming noontide. But he hadn't anticipated the effect such a powerful force would have upon him in this drugged state. It consumed him. Ost could feel the flowing currents around him like they were extensions of his arms and legs. He could detect the seemingly infinite sparks of the metals in the sand. He could almost hear the hum of the electrical charges like glowing embers of light, marking the living things all around him. A prone, unmoving object on the sand enticed its burrowing inhabitants to the surface to investigate. All the little life forms Ost was sensing around him, crabs, worms, and other assorted scavengers, began to peer through the vents of small bubbling sand geysers. They stepped and skittered, slithered, or swished out of their dens tentatively and began to probe for the potential food source recently arrived. The fleeting moments of the venom's ecstasy ensnared Ost so fully that he didn't flinch or swipe when little clawed legs, pinchers, and sucking mouth parts began to probe his skin. The lack of resistance urged them on, and they began to climb over his body. They picked at his flesh delicately at first, cleaning little bits that he wouldn't miss. The eagerness of the work steadily increased as no protest arose until eventually their testing touches grew more hungering. A particularly gnarly-looking crab found what it likely believed was the exposed tip of a plump tunnel worm, but was in fact Ost's nipple, enticingly erect from the effects of the venom's euphoria. Claws that could sever small fish in half, positioned to savage their unsuspecting prey. But just as Ost's obliviousness was about to be tested to the extreme, a brown sludgy blur streaked by, and the crab vanished. For a few hectic moments, traces of its flailing legs and claws were visible swirling in among the clouded brown slurry within the dredgio. But then the movement stopped, and the dredge consumed the body rapidly, dissolving the last remaining bits from sight. This scene of predator and prey went on beyond Ost's comprehension, for though the strange connectedness that came with Coral's venom was already fading as it usually did all too quickly, an overwhelming force was intruding upon his peaceful stupor and rapidly consuming his mind. Ost had hoped to lose himself in the venom's fantasy, disappearing into the feeling of the ocean and the sand beneath him. It always helped him forget all the other things he didn't like to think about or feel in his life. But he made one major miscalculation. All the forces to which Ost hoped to escape were even more closely bound to beckon when the rise of the moon summoned. The waters, the sand, even the creatures of the sea were all subject to that lunar draw. And by connecting himself so thoroughly to those things, Ost gave himself over to that upward compulsion he sought so hard to escape. The moon called, and Ost could do nothing but heed it. Ost's resistance to the heavenly summons dissipated without even a murmured thought and objection. He merely stopped fighting the persistent tug towards the surface and even adjusted his buoyancy to assist. Without moving a muscle, Ost began to float in a steadily increasing pace towards the surface. A rain of startled and fleeing scavengers fell from his body in an attempt to return to the bottom where they dwelled. Only half made it past the gaping jaws of Funk, who swam underneath, helping himself to the sudden convenience of a feast from above. The two forces worked together, the power of the water pushing upwards to expel Ost's suddenly buoyant form, and the tugging effect of the approaching moon dragging him towards it lustily. His eyes remained closed, the only understanding of what was going on around him experienced through the fading awareness of the coral venom, and the electrical connection to his surroundings. Then something utterly unbelievable occurred, and though a million dimming sensations still consumed Ost's thoughts, the shock of this one outcompeted them all. His body breached the surface at last, but his ascent didn't stop there, and the surface rose with him. Like a building swell, the sea followed Ost's rising form into the air, caressing him, embracing him, and holding him aloft several body lengths above the rest of the ocean's surface in a large, bulging tidal mass of water. The shock of the experience brought Ost out of the last lingering effects of the venom with a jolt, his eyes springing open to behold the unthinkable. But his sudden disbelief wasn't restricted to the strange phenomenon occurring around him, for the scene on the horizon was even more surprising still. What he saw far out there, just on the edge of the skyline, almost beyond view, could only be described as dire. The narrow slit of the sun's disk had only just begun to peek over the dark line where the sea meets the sky. Its violet light had begun to tinge the darkness just a bit, threatening night with the burning glow of a lavender morning. But the sun seemed to be in a race with the sea, and it was losing. As the sun crept above the line of the horizon, the sea appeared to edge higher in response. At a few points, the boundary of the sea even erased the sun's progress altogether, darkening the coming dawn with the rising wall of a moontide. But this was like no moontide Ost had ever heard of. It was as if the sea were a drape of fabric laid across the horizon, and someone standing behind where the sun even now tried to climb was pinching the material of the ocean in their fingers to each side of the straining sunrise, and lifting it to thwart the coming morning light. Only it wasn't a pair of hands lifting the walls of water in a dual swell. It was the moons of Tethys and Erithus rising in the sky together on opposite sides of the violet star, locked together in orbit and dragging the unprecedented raging bulk of a twin moontide behind them. Well, there aren't giant moons racing through, and trust me, as you go deeper in the series, the ocean gets scarier. The shock of what Ost saw broke whatever strange concentration maintained his tidal platform. The watery bulge supporting him dropped suddenly and dissipated into the surrounding waves, depositing him back into the now tossing surface of the sea. Only one thought filled his mind, despite the nature of his recent discovery, and the lingering haze of his drug high. He looked to the slithering and surprising plumper form of Funk nearby and spoke the thought aloud. "We have to warn the children." The words uttered, the look of fear evident on his face, Ost shot off through the waves with a massive surge of speed. All of the traits which made him a child of the sea, driving the stroke of his arms and the fluid and flexible kick of his legs with sleek and swift precision. Tears of Hatsune Mug. It's that power that keeps me through. Chapter 2. The village of the barges consisted of a floating jumble of rafts and corkwood huts on platforms. Everything was lashed together and interconnected with the bridges and piers, but it was so loosely constructed that some parts occasionally broke free and floated off, only to be hauled in and reattached to the town at a different point. There could be no better reflection of life upon the world of Nyx. Nyx was water, water was fluid and ever-changing, and nothing in the water world of Nyx was allowed to be permanent, especially with the raging force of moontides with which to contend. But even impermanence couldn't protect these people from what was coming now, Oz suspected. Where were the guardians of the tide? Where were the tide callers to warn the people of the barges that a moontide was coming? A twin moontide. Maybe that was exactly it, Oz realized. Two moontides traveling together was unheard of, surely. If it had ever happened and anyone managed to survive, that was unlikely a story that would have faded into memory quickly. Yet Oz was confident he'd never heard of such a thing. Maybe neither had the guardians. Perhaps it was more than they could handle. It seemed altogether likely to Oz that nobody was coming to warn or save them. He was pretty used to that concept, though since his parents abandoned him at the barges when he was very young. As an orphan on the barges, without a family name, you were primarily left to yourself. A few older residents offered some food and a bit of care now and then, but the orphan children of the barges, for the most part, were a self-raised bunch. They had to fend for themselves and hoped they were tenacious and cunning enough to reach adulthood. That's just the way life was on the barges. Well, at least, that's the way it was before Ost came along. Names in Nyx were as fluid as the people. Although your given name and even family name, if you had one, stayed pretty consistent, your name as a whole tended to transform along with you as you did. For those without a family name, their first surname was often given, or for arrogant ones taken. But it usually was a statement on your placement in life, a reflection of the world's view of your place within it. Oz received many names from others throughout his life. He had that effect on people. Not all of them were names appropriate to utter in public, although a few times such obscenities were screamed across the milling crowds on a market day. But there was one name he earned over the past few years which he was rather proud of. Ost, the Orphan King. He was always resilient and self-reliant enough to fend for himself. When the orphaned elderly residents of the barges came to offer food or attention, Ost only accepted the gifts to give it a bit more to someone who had little. He could find his own meals just fine, so any proffered charity received was directed towards those who truly needed it. Over time, that trait gained him a young and worshipful following, and over a little more time his strange sense of responsibility ended up earning him a place in charge of an unruly gang composed of all the barge's abandoned orphans. In thanks for the care and protection he offered, those children dubbed him the Orphan King. It was those children Ost went to give warning to now, for he was sure nobody else would. There was a selfishness about life in Nyx. It was part of the reason why so many children found themselves left to places like the barges while their parents continued on their endless journeys of riding the waves. Those adults who did remain to take care of others at the barges, the families who cared for their children and raised the generations of their line, looked down upon the nameless orphans. They were little more than refuse, only worth acknowledging as a lesson to others. That's why Ost held another name among them, mirrored from the Orphan King. Families of the barges called him the Muck Wrangler, for no one else would dirty themselves with the filth he handled. And the reference wasn't just directed at his disgusting little Dredgio. Whatever they called him, Ost knew where his responsibilities lay. The families could fend for themselves, but the orphans of the barges had no family but him, and he was the only one who would lift a finger to protect them. As Ost neared the floating village, he spotted the first and perhaps most important of his charges. Like Ost and his daily ritual with the spine coral, Gev had a morning ritual of his own. Although the number was always one, every single time he greeted it, Gev needed to count the sun before he would allow himself to begin his day. Gev counted everything. It was the boy's bizarre obsession, an effort for his struggling mind to grasp his surroundings. Of course, it was an oddity among many, but of all the small child's peculiarities, the counting anything and everything was undoubtedly the most extreme. Although it was an impediment to many things in his life, it was also where Gev shined. He had a way with numbers that amazed even the most astute calculators among them. Sadly, it was because of his oddities Gev almost never was. Deformities and weaknesses weren't well accepted in the harsh world of Nyx. Parents often felt they were doing the best they could when leaving what they deemed lesser-born children to the waves instead of watching them grow up struggling in a world that wouldn't offer leniency. I suppose that's why the decision to cast Gev to the currents was made, but his parents apparently hadn't expected that downstream the abandoned child would encounter a stout, self-reliant boy with a penchant for taking in orphans of all kinds, even stinky little number counters. For that reason and many more, Gev had a special place in Ost's heart. He was a little ray of sunshine to everyone around him, except when his religion of numbers failed him. When his world could not be defined and broken down in calculations, Gev would break down, unable to function or even make audible sounds. It was because of this dependency that the child suffered from one of the most petrifying fears a boy could bear in a world of all oceans. He was afraid of the sea. The waves were infinite and ever-changing. Gev could never grasp the sea's existence because he could never define it by the only language he trusted and knew. He was forever a prisoner upon a raft within the infinite expanse of his most horrifying nightmares. Despite it all, he smiled and acted strong, even for a 4-year-old orphan child. Ost respected that and loved him even more for it. Gev was a delicate, frail-looking child with a light and love for life so big and bright it was unbelievable it could be contained in such a small body. That light gleamed despite a darkness of fear and entrapment that consumed the child's tiny life every time he looked out beyond the piers and planks of the lashed Corkwood village. The secret of seeing, for him at least, was in finding complete and utter joy in every other thing in his life, and somehow that light fought back the oppressively present darkness. It was hard to believe it was only 3 years earlier when Oz pulled his soaked wailing bundle out of the waves, but for that act of heroism, Oz gained his recognition as the thing Gev loved most in this world, besides Funk. Gev's head didn't quite come up to Ost's waist. He was skinny as all orphans were, though not unhealthily so. Despite that, he always appeared wan and runty. His hair was colorless, not entirely white, just an opaque, muted strand with no pigmentation at all, almost like the jelly-like strands of a sea spider. His skin remained pale no matter how much sun he received, but despite all appearances, this emotionally strong yet physically weak child exuded a sense of hopeful wonder in his world with almost everything he did. At the moment, Gev was entertaining himself with the presence of a coral kit. They were furry little bundles of cuteness with all too soft and affectionate of eyes, and little pink-lapping tongues. Oz couldn't quite imagine how something that cute hadn't been wiped out of existence much earlier merely out of spite, but he had to admit coral kits made Gev happy. Coincidentally, they also made Funk happy, only in a different way. The Dredgeel's body, after having fed to brimming recently, now seeped a pungent brown trail in its wake as it slid just beneath the waves in what for Funk was a stealthy manner. Oz saw it coming, only the eel struck before he could say anything. Funk burst from the water in a wriggling spout of hungering black. His bulging brown body slid across the coarse wood of the platform, riding the waves of his slime trail in a slick, speedy blur. The eel's gaping maw spread wider open as he accelerated with a gurgling hiss. All the coral kit could do was emit a rather adorable chirp of fear before being swallowed by the gluttonous Dredgeel. The soft yet frightened eyes peered out, somewhat confused as the sludge around it consumed fluffy fur and pouty cheeks. Kits were soft-bodied creatures, and it vanished much more rapidly within the dissolving dredge than the earlier munched-upon crustaceans. "Bad Funk," Gev cried, but despite it all, the little boy couldn't help but giggle just a little as he yelled it. They were the best of friends, and Funk's voraciousness had committed similar atrocities many times in the past. However, Gev was a stern chiter, and he never allowed Funk to get away without a good scolding for his lack of manners. "He was my friend, Funk. He was cute." He stuck out his lip poutingly, a trick that often worked for others but only ever emboldened Funk. "Was yum, too," Funk managed to belch out in a sickening, bubbling gurgle. Dredgeels didn't have the gift of speech exactly. They had no true solid structure, so they lacked the vocal cords and other necessary parts to speak. However, lacking a visible brain amidst their sludge, Dredgeels were surprisingly smart, and a few like Funk could admit some of their foul little noises in mimicry of people speak. Oz knew his arrival at the barges was already given away by Funk's little performance. Everyone knew if you smelled Funk, Oz was likely not far behind. Gev was bright enough to realize this and immediately began looking around for his favorite person, but the two of them had a game. Surprise was one of the key factors in it. Oz decreased his buoyancy and sank silently beneath the surface, descending the short distance to the sea bottom. Those who steered the barge's path always made sure to anchor at the shallowest points of any of the isles on their migration, so he was only a few feet below the waves when he touched the sandy ground. He immediately thrust upwards with a kick at the same time. He rapidly increased his buoyancy. The two simultaneous forces sent him accelerating upwards with a churning rush. Like one of the great singing behemoths of the deep sea performing their wave-crashing dances, Oz breached the surface with a surge. Thankfully, he mused, the ocean didn't rise with him this time. Although an impressive pluming rush of wash and spray exploded from his body as he escaped the watery realm. Gev fell back on his butt, squealing with delight as Oz rose several body lengths into the air, only to come crashing down upon the wooden platform of the barges directly in front of him. The young boy began to clap and giggle. "Oz!" he cried with clear, overjoyed delight. But the boy's mood changed suddenly, as it so often did. It was almost mercurial. "Oz, Funk ate my friend," he told on the eel, though there was a smile lurking behind the young child's pout. "Did you do that, Funk?" Oz asked, even though he knew the answer. He didn't hide a smile in the least. "Yum," Funk belched happily, where he lay in a hugely bloated pile of slime and coiling eel body. He was overly full, but Oz felt certain if another coral kit made the mistake of showing itself, it would most likely join the other one in the eel's foul, slurry-filled stomach. The tattling only lasted a moment, for Gev could never resist getting a hug from Oz on greeting, no matter how long they were apart. I suppose when even your orphans, your parents, don't bother to drop you off somewhere and instead throw you to the sea, you likely feel grateful to anyone who sticks around. Ost had to admit that he kind of loved the hugs too. It wasn't as if his parents were around to give him any either, but he was the orphan king and he couldn't let the world realize where there was a heart of gold within this vagabond miscreant. He accepted the exuberant embrace while maintaining a firm, steady demeanor, despite the warm rush the little boy's clutch sent through him. "Good morning, Gev," Ost greeted, as he tousled the young child's colorless hair. Gev looked up, beaming for just a moment, but it faded suddenly. Once more the boy's mood changed with rapid fluidity. The trait was common among the people of this world of water, but for Gev it seemed even more pronounced. "Not good," the child said, as he shook his head gravely. Two. He kept repeating the word, pointing where, even now, Ost should be able to see the rising sun. But all he could make out was the eerily bowed shadow line of the horizon, rising to thwart the day's dawn. Gev meant the 2 moons, Ost realized. He knew it was coming, too. "Gev," Ost called to the young boy, "I need you to go warn the others. Tell them to get anything they need and get food, too. We may have to leave here." Gev looked terrified by the last suggestion. "I'll do what I can to not let that happen, but I need to make sure everybody is in one place so I can protect you. Can you do that for me?" Gev nodded his head. He grabbed Ost's hand as if to bring him along. "I'm sorry, Gev, I need to warn the others." They were jerks, of course, and didn't deserve his consideration in the least. But there was this heart of gold thing which kept getting in the way of his selfish considerations. He couldn't let anything happen to them without at least giving them a chance. Gev looked back, frightened and unsure. "2, Ost said bluntly as he pointed to the horizon. He was using the one language the boy truly understood. Gev's eyes widened, and he turned to run in the opposite direction to gather the orphans. "Good boy," Ost muttered to himself. Chapter 3. Final chapter tonight, I believe. Yes, final chapter for the night. Ost walked the town of the barges as if he owned it, and depending on the particular quarter he likely did in a way, the title of Orphan King came with few benefits. His vagabond army was fairly fierce and territorial, and Ost's protection emboldened them to claim a peace for themselves among the floating village. But whether he was among the planked platform paths and rambling huts of the orphan kingdom, or the well-tended raft homes and walkways of the barges' families, Ost always strode with an evident self-assurance. No one ever dared to question his arrogance, though others certainly scorned him. The truth was, Ost was quite a remarkable specimen, and it was hard not to notice, just looking at him. Any cockiness he exuded, most would admit, if a bit jealously, he deserved. His hair was a sprawl of chaotic gold and bronze-tangled curls, like the tossing surface of the sea during the season of tempests. Although it was disheveled, it looked right on his rugged yet soft boyish face. His entire appearance held the feel of wild, messy abandon. But in the combined features of Ost, this unkemptness created a being almost unworthy of a moment's held breath in awe, if caught in just the right tilted cast of the sun's rays. Despite the undeniable attractiveness of his slim-cut body and dashing features, he maintained a paradoxical modest cockiness. He would blush if you told him how handsome or deviously clever he was. Then he'd deny it and insist he wasn't all that. But whenever he climbed free of the sea to soak in the warming rays of the sun, there was always an assured smirk and a smile. He knew others were looking. He'd meet their eyes, a kind welcome or acknowledgement, but he was only really taking note of who liked what they saw. Ost's eyes were probably the greatest weapons among his arsenal of charms. Long, delicate lashes created a hint of gentleness, rendering their natural metallic hue into something akin to sparkling innocence. Whether he knew their full power or not, his eyes were disarmingly effective upon those weak to that sort of thing. A glance from Ost was known to melt many hearts. Ost was shirtless at the moment. He rarely ever wore one, except when the prudish elders of the barges insisted. He honestly never understood why people who were born to the water were so insistent on clothing. It just created drag and slowed you down. But to silence their protests, Ost was kind enough to wear a pair of oiled shorts and occasionally a sleek sleeveless shirt. The shorts were all he wore for this visit. Some would likely protest him entering their area, appearing disheveled and underdressed, but he had important news and no time to look for something they might consider appropriate. I think somebody's cooking something. I can smell something in the house. There was a different feel to this section of the barges. It was part of a world Ost knew almost nothing about, a world of generations and familial bonds. It was a world of loyalties and traditions based on blood and relations. When the elderly of the families could no longer ride the waves, they retired here to their family homes, where they raised the children of the coming generations. And when they began to enter their failing years, they could count on the younger generations to tend them in turn. There was never anyone like that for Ost or any of his orphan family. They were forced to fend for themselves. A world where there were people to care for you when you were sick or feed you when you were hungry was only something recently experienced in the orphan kingdom. Everyone knew it was only possible because Ost chose to do everything in his power to provide those things. The family houses were built from finely hewn corkwood boards and treated with saps and resins to protect them from the elements. The orphan king had none of these luxuries. The orphans' homes, if you could even call them that, were shacks and shanties built from the salvaged flotsam and other debris hauled in from the currents. No family remained to tend the home for the next generation. Orphans found a place to live and tried to hold on to it until they died or someone took it from them. Housing was just one more issue Oss was trying to remedy for his orphans, but he didn't understand construction or how to treat corkwood with resin, and most certainly didn't have the money to buy the fancy materials used to build homes like these. Oss was trying, however, and worked well with what little was available. At the very least, he could now brag that the majority of the orphans' shacks barely leaked when it rained. That was progress. When it came down to it, making sure they had a safe place to go home to at night was all that truly mattered. Loincloth. It's actually sea grabbers, which I will describe later in the Atlas of Nyx, have very thick hides, and those hides are taken and tanned and stretched like leather, and they're what make most of the clothing of Nyx. There's also something similar and furry, like a sea, the sea kit, like a seal that can be used. Gigas wears gray sealskin pants. The family... He resented the families a little. Of course, he knew he should resent his own family for abandoning him, but they weren't there inside of his wrath. Admittedly, there was always a part of him buried down deep, which hoped they'd come back someday. Oss certainly didn't want to risk that hope by slandering their memory, so he pointed his resentment towards those who had what he didn't. It helped that they tended to look down on him for not having the same as they did, but it never helped replace the part he always felt was missing. Missing, that is, until the day he found it within the adoring looks of his orphan army. There was one family who stood above all others. Their word directed the community, and their voices could spread through the families like blood on the water. The only downside to this convenience was such stature came with arrogance and attitude. Needless to say, Oss didn't have a great relationship with the Velm family. But then, they were perhaps his greatest ridiculers, so there was little chance of even cordial encounters most of the time. Today was different, however. There was great need, and the Velms, as distasteful as Oss found them, were the best people to delegate and organize preparations for the coming moontide. Of course, they had the grandest house. Their family went back in traceable line for generations, and all of them grew up here in this finely crafted floating domicile. They claimed to be one of the remaining founding families from the barge's formation, counting off their line so far back no one had any way to confirm or deny their assertions. They bragged greatness was merely in their bloodline, and that fact probably wouldn't have bothered Oss so much if the Velms weren't so consistently, irritatingly perfect and good in every way that seemed to matter to anyone, anywhere. Oss was surprised to discover the two prodigal sons not out front, doing their daily morning production of bros getting buff. They dedicated themselves to their bodies, so they rarely missed a ritual workout. It was an obstacle, which Oss was thankful not to have to bypass in his endeavor, as he and the two young Velms had a somewhat contentious relationship. Their absence hinted that perhaps the family already knew of the coming danger and were making preparations for the town and its residents. Oss rapped a few times on the side of the door frame, but he didn't wait for an answer to enter. He had no intention of waiting around to do things in the sluggish pace of the family's regular formal etiquette and procedure. He certainly wasn't going to start by being polite. The Velm's house raft wasn't immense, but it was undoubtedly impressive. There were hammocks woven of sagrasa grass for over 30 family members, and extra space for everyone to gather and eat. The home had numerous nooks to hoard the wealth such prominent people inevitably accumulate. But strangely, there was almost no one home this early in the morning. No one, that is, but the very two boys whose absence Oss so recently noted, Trit and Nace Velm. The Velm brothers were maybe a year apart. Oss didn't know their exact age difference, although they were all three in the same general range. He refused to ever show them attention if he didn't have to. They received plenty of it from everyone else already, so Oss certainly wasn't going to feed their egos even more by asking. Trit was so breathtakingly perfectly beautiful, Oss had to hate him simply out of principle alone. He was a bronze skin like all of the Velms, but the bronze sheen of his skin seemed pure, more metallic, almost across his tightly rippled, muscular frame. Trit was the perfected culmination of all the traits that made the Velm family so prominent over generations. He was a shining star in his parents' eyes, almost gaggingly good, honest, and honorable. If you could fit any more of the things Oss hated into a Nyxian, he couldn't for the life of him think of it. Nace, unfortunately, for his self-esteem, was almost everything Trit was, but just a little less. The only thing that the older brother excelled at was his jealousy at how much grandeur in his family's eyes his more perfect younger brother stole from him when he came of age behind him. Despite the strange hostility that hovered in the air between the two, they were always together. Both were sitting side by side, staring longingly and a bit disconcerted at the doorway when Ost barged in. The boys jumped to their feet, but seemed caught off guard when they realized who it was. Ost! Get your filthy body out of our house, Nathan demanded immediately. Ost wasn't sure why he'd be dirty. He just came from the water. He was dripping perfectly clean water all over the fancy polished corkwood floor. Where is everyone? Ost asked, ignoring this slightly shorter brother's outburst. There's trouble. I need to see your father. I'm sorry, Ost, they have all left, Tritt replied, in the most annoyingly perfect response he could give. But certainly, it can't be as bad as you imply. A moontide is coming, so yeah, it's bad. Now where's your father? Grandma was talking funny, Nace interjected. He took her to the bilgewater to speak with the Reefweiser. If Tritt wasn't going to provide the answer, Nace was perfectly willing to beat him to it. Anything to get one up on his younger brother. Did you hear them mention a moontide? Ost asked. Oh, my face itches for some reason. Sorry. It is impolite to listen in on your elders, Ost. Of course I didn't hear them say anything. Ost groaned with exasperation. He couldn't stand such unthinking adherence to rules and politeness. Why didn't you go with them, he asked, feeling a bit mystified by these people. We have to exercise, Nace raged out his answer. We're just waiting for the sun to come up. It's late. It's already up, guys, Ost replied as he turned back to exit the door. He rolled his eyes so blatantly he would have been surprised if even those two missed it. It's just hidden behind the coming twin moontide. Tethys and Erithus are almost overhead. The barges is stuck smack dab in their path. I hope you have something to hold on to. Ost wasn't sure why he taunted them like that on his way out. He should have known that it would catch their interest enough to make them follow despite their strict schedules. The last thing he wanted was two Velns tailing him, especially those two. But that's precisely what he earned with his mouthiness, a following of boy perfect and boy almost perfect, and both of them were perfectly bothersome. Ew! Tritt called out as he stepped outside. You brought that thing with you! He was pointing down at the bubbling brown stain in the water where Funk was patiently awaiting Ost's return. You! Ew! Funk retorted, then slipped beneath the water with a rather flatulent-sounding dismissal. Ost laughed and turned towards his destination. The streaming brown mess of his friend slid through the waves just beneath the floating platforms of the city. As he ran across them, Tritt and Nace followed behind with an annoying lightness that bugged Ost for no discernible reason. The Bilgewater was a sort of combination tavern and inn, as well as the meeting place of a local Reefweiser. Good Lord, my nose! I just shaved today, so I'm guessing that has something to do with it, but... It was also the town center where the old people made up all their stupid rules. There was almost always a crowd of patrons, and today it was filled with the heads of nearly every prominent faction on the barges. Ost knew it was coming. He was wondering about it that morning. It was the inevitable freak-out which always went with any disruption to the sedentary life of the floating village, but this time every bit of panic was warranted, and he hoped they'd act accordingly. Ost almost left it there. He almost turned around and left the families to their own devices. It was clear they knew a moontide was coming. There was very little ease Ost could provide them. Little else Ost provided them, but in the back of his mind the question whispered, do they know it's a twin moontide? Do they know it's coming right for us? And do they realize how close it is, even though the tide callers haven't appeared yet to warn them? Ost couldn't answer those questions, and that pestering heart of gold refused to let him turn away until he could. He dreaded the certain discomfort of speaking before them all, but he had to know. They may not care what happened to him or the orphans, but, for some reason, a small part of Ost cared what happened to them. Gigas Veln, the eldest matriarch of the Veln clan, sat centrally to the gathered old folks. A call must have gone out to the families regarding the moontide, for there were a fair number of family heads attending the gathering in the open tap room of the Bilgewater. Everyone seemed agitated but intent on the aged and heavily weathered bronze-skinned woman before them. I tell you I'm not daft, the old woman argued, with harsh acerbity. My womb may be all dried up, but it can still feel the pull of the moons like when I rode the waves in my younger days. She grabbed the paunch of her gut, where it overhung the band of her gray sealskin leggings, and shook it for emphasis. Nothing feels like Tethys in my belly. That silver beast practically twists my insides in a knot. We will concede that point, Veln Mother. Your, womb has never been wrong before, Keltas Veln, son to Gigas and father to Tritt and Nace replied. Talking about his mother's body parts clearly discomfited him, but from the feel of the room he was the one granted authority for the rest of those gathered to speak with the old woman. He had no choice. It is the part where you claim that Erithus rises to that we have our doubts. My tits don't lie, Kel, the old woman said bluntly as she grabbed the sagging parts, so recently and uncomfortably mentioned. Gigas was old. She didn't care. It was said she rode the waves as a guardian of the tide for many years before finally retiring to care for her family at the barges. Something about that experience made her ornery and irascible, though, and she was a constant blight upon her family. The Valens excused her behavior as a product of her great age. Oz simply saw she was too spirited to live all prim and proper the way everyone else in her family insisted upon acting. Celtus Velen was horrified as his mother's breast slipped out of the meager cover the old woman used to appease the prudes. True, he suckled at that same breast and had seen numerous others, but something about the sight of her wrinkled, sagging parts made him wrench himself violently in the opposite direction and turned red with a flush of embarrassment. A woman knows, Kel, especially a woman who spent her life riding the moontides. Erithus pulls you from the chest. It brings new mothers to milk. If I say I feel the moons in my breast and belly, then I tell you Tethys and Erithus are coming. Celtus almost retched with his disgust. Oz couldn't help but silently dare the old woman to go on to explain where the red moon of Mathis got her all excited. Preposterous! A voice called from the crowd, and there were growing murmurs of anger and agreement. The families of the barges were too stuck in their ways to even accept when something different happened in the world around them. For a race born of water and its fluidity and change, they clung to their old rules and methods with the stubbornness of rock sometimes. Oz wasn't sure how his words could change the direction of this conversation. No one here liked him much. Many outright hated him, but he felt inclined to give his evidence in support of the old woman. She was right and didn't deserve to be slandered because the others were too dense to see it. He just hoped he wouldn't cause more harm in the process. No one had taken notice of Oz yet, besides Trit and Ace, who followed him in. While the door was open, Funk slithered in as well, and now lay bloated and coiled near Oz's feet. The eel stench would only grow, revealing their presence all too soon, so Oz decided he might as well speak up now before the growing Funk announced him, and he was forced to bear the added scrutiny for that offense too. She's right, Oz called over the din. Tethys and Erithus bring the moontide along the path of the rising sun. A twin moontide is barreling down the Sagrasa Beltway, and the barges are anchored smack in the middle of the two combined swells. As if we would give the word of the muck wrangler any merit, a voice called out. Oz wasn't sure who said it, but it didn't matter, because it mirrored the sentiment of just about everyone in the Bilgewater at that moment, whether they spoke up or not. In their eyes, Oz was vermin, a vagabond who should remain beneath their notice, but somehow this lowlife rose to a position of authority among a faction of the populace. Such stature couldn't be ignored within their particular standards, though they genuinely wished to. Granted, they had never afforded him even a scrap of authority in their elite world, but they grudgingly conceded that his cobbled-together position warranted some recognition despite his lowly nature. They even more grudgingly acknowledged that as leader of almost a quarter of the barge's population, Oz deserved at least a modicum of voice among them. That was part of the reason they disliked him so much. Most felt he should have stayed within his own station and not striven to something he wasn't worthy of. Celtus Velen cast a discerning glare towards Oz, but the judgment was already made clear by the glint of his eyes. He gave a slight lifting motion with his head as a signal. Oz knew it was coming, even before he felt the firm grips of Trit and Nace taken by the arms and forcefully guide him to the center of the Bilgewater, to stand before their father. A wetter, more clinging grasp accompanied their clutching holds as Funk coiled round Oz's ankle to come along for the ride. How is it you claim to see this twin moontide when none of us have been able to? We've been scanning for the signs of a moonrise since midnight after my mother's warning. No one has seen the lunar swell, Celtus Velen demanded. It was clear he hoped to silence his mother's absurdity quickly, and blamed Oz now wholly for the failure of that plan. I was caught up by a rogue wave earlier, Oz lied. He knew he couldn't tell them the truth about his experience while high on spine coral venom. Although honestly, Oz wasn't entirely positive what the truth about the concurrence was himself, so he blurted out the most likely alternative. I decided to ride it, and well, when I was up there, I looked to the horizon and saw Tethys and Erithus racing the sunrise. Why do you think it's still dark out? The sun should have been up an hour ago. Trit, you were just outside. What did you see? Is there any sign of this moontide? There was no need even to hear the answer to know those claims Celtus would trust. Know whose claims Celtus would trust. The prodigal boy Perfection stood at attention to give his answer. Though he continued to clutch the arm of his prisoner tightly, he could do nothing else. It was his duty to do as ordered in all things. Father Velen, when this cretin broke into our home and told us what he just told you, I went outside to check as per procedure. He announced the act a little too exuberantly. One by one he counted off the markers checked. There was no visible swell in the water. The anchor lines still hold at their proper angles. I even checked the Sagrasa grass. It hasn't begun spawning in response to the lunar pull. Absolutely no moons visible on the horizon. Although I do agree with Oz about one thing. It's odd that the sun is not out yet. That last statement seemed to discomfort Trit greatly, but he was nowhere near as disconcerted as Nace was at having not even been questioned by his father. It was weird out there, though, Nace tried to interject. The water looked higher. They ignored him. See, Keltisvelen announced to everyone gathered as if to appease them. The signs don't show a moontide. The rules are clear on how they are detected. Besides, the guardians of the tide would be here if such a thing were happening. Your stupid rules don't matter now, Ost argued. This is different, and the guardians can't protect you from this. The reason you don't see a swell is that it's not a single moontide, and it's an entire wall of water being driven forward by both moons. There's no single rising wave to mark it, just a slight dip in the center where the pull's weakest. It'll destroy the barges unless you move it now. That is utterly ridiculous, Keltis scoffed. Get in the damn water, then, you fool! What is wrong with you people that you can't feel it? Ost twitched as he said it, as if acknowledging the draw of the moon's grasp somehow gave it more power over him. Ha! Gigasvelen cackled. You tell them, boy. These dry skins have spent too much time on their little wooden floats. They need to feel the sea before they tell someone else what's coming. I know you mean well, Mother, but don't encourage this nuisance. My son, Kel, listen to the Orphan King. He didn't just see it. He can feel it. Look at the way his muscles tremble. Look at how he can barely stand there still with the force of the moons coming down upon him. That boy is tidal-born. He knows what's coming. She said it with such stark certainty that Ost trembled, half expecting the moons would choose that very moment to drag him kicking and screaming into the sky. I don't care if you believe me or not. Do what you will, Ost admitted as he began to wrestle against the clutches of the Velen brothers to break loose. I have other more important lives to take care of. Let me go. I am ordered to hold you. Stop resisting. Trit and Nace both spoke with practiced command in unison. I'm not staying, Ost told them. Funk? There was a retching, slopping sound as the Dredgeel's tail swiped from Ost's ankle, fast as a whip, to splatter both of the brothers with filth in quick order. No matter how steadfast they were to obey, no one could resist jumping back from one of Funk's projectile spews. Ost was released quickly enough after, as both of the handsome boys were splattered with enough eel filth to make them much less appealing. But Keltis wasn't about to allow anyone to counter his authority so easily. He was a Velen. No one disobeyed a Velen. Well, no one but Ost, the Orphan King. Stop! Vermin, he yelled as he stepped forward to take over his son's abandoned task. Several larger men from the crowd moved in to join him. I would probably stop if I were you, Ost warned sincerely. He's getting kind of mad, and he gets even madder when people tell me where I can and can't go. You will not leave until this matter is finished, Keltisvelen insisted. Funk was driven too far. With a growling splat, the fat, bloated Dredgeel dropped from Ost's ankle and began to wriggle towards the threatening figure. Get that creature away from me. Not my decision to make. That's Funk's choice. Talk to him, Ost answered, as he slowly backed towards the door. I am not talking to that disgusting ooze. Somebody kill that thing and get it out of here. And you just decided for him. Sorry, Ost said as he reached down for the door handle. He ate a lot today, too. This is gonna be bad. A threatening, gurgling sound grew steadily from Funk as his body began to quiver in trembling seizures like a quaking bowl of limp jellyfish. The brownish, sludgy funk within him began to froth and bubble beneath the thin membrane of slime that contained him, but the layer was no longer expanding to accommodate the growing contents like when the eel feasted. It was stretched well beyond the limits of its strength, as the dredge within reacted to Funk's stress, churning and swelling until he popped. Or pooped, as the case may be. Ost had the door open and was sliding out just before the explosion. The last thing he saw was Gigasvelen uproariously cackling as she ducked behind a counter. You deserve it, you idiots, he heard her add for good measure just before the Dredgeel released his stinking fecal dredge cloud in a gushing blast. I'm not cleaning that up, Ost called mockingly, his departure marked by the soft splashing of his body piercing the waves. Ta-da! And that is the end of Chapter 3.